would confidently say Berlin is worth the hype. I would actually beg to differ and say it's probably the perfect type of city to move with the family. I used to think I was completely adaptable and very flexible and could live everywhere. The city to really go to if you have the energy and the time and the interest to explore. I was scammed twice. Umdaka. Just want to say before I dive into today's video, I have the utmost respect for people who do this while juggling all kinds of things. I'm struggling so much to find time for YouTube and a commitment to myself to come back to the space because I really enjoy it. It's been an incredibly affirming space. It's a place where I can pour into my interests and hobbies, and it's just kind of like a visual diary. I get to sit down, put my thoughts together and share my experience with others, and that was really the motivation for even starting a channel to begin with. And I'm so grateful for all the new subscribers who just joined us in the past couple of weeks. So welcome to all the new ones, and hi to my regular subscribers. Really love the community that we're building here, and I am always pleasantly surprised by the emails that I receive. I think I receive far more emails than I ever had anticipated. So please keep those coming, and please bear with me as I try and find my rhythm while juggling motherhood, reintegrating into South Africa or back into South Africa, finding space for all the uncomfortable feelings that come with that, and just also finding time for my hobbies such as YouTube. So as you can see from the title, today I'm discussing whether Berlin was worth the hype. This is a question I've received a lot while I was in Germany and also during my time in South Africa. It was difficult for me, to be honest, to put my thoughts together while I was in the country, and as you'd have it, sometimes things make more sense retrospectively. And I felt, to be honest, so many people cover this topic, I didn't know if I would add anything valuable to the platform, all things Berlin, travel, Germany, and whether it's worth the hype. But you know what? You requested it, and so I hope that my perspective is valuable. So the first thing I want to highlight is, for those who are new here, that I moved to Germany already having had some kind of relationship with the country to begin with. So the decision to move to Berlin was a strategic one, just because a political hub happened to be in that particular city. And to be honest, I also wanted to experience a different part of Germany that I wasn't so familiar with. So I wasn't necessarily drawn to Berlin because it's the capital city and there's this hype and it's creative and it's international. If anything, it was more of a strategic alignment. Also moved with my children, and so I knew that a more international environment could be a little bit interesting for us, but perhaps would also offer us different opportunities in terms of finding schools, in terms of finding a community. So really, the reason why I moved to Berlin specifically was motivated perhaps by different things than other people. I know for a fact that a lot of people aim to move to Berlin because of its vibrance, its international, the fact that it's so international, and the fact that it is the capital city, and historically it's a beautiful city. It's a must-see if you're in Germany. But those were not my motivations, and so my experience, I think, was very much influenced by the fact that I honestly did not have a lot of expectations moving into that city. So is Berlin worth the hype? To be honest with you, as a mother of two who was living in Berlin for over a year, I would confidently say Berlin is worth the hype. However, I, as Dambisa, have a preference for other parts of Germany, Baden-Württemberg to be specific. I'm a fan of the South. I'm a traditionalist in that sense. I love the fact that that part of Germany is a little bit more typical Germany, or what you'd expect, I think, maybe stereotypically from the country. I also love the architecture, the food. So I am a little bit of a fan of the south of Germany, also because of the nostalgia that's attached to that part of Germany from my own past. So in that sense, I missed the traditional or the more typical German elements in an international city such as Berlin, but I would confidently say that Berlin is worth the hype. So Berlin is vibrant. There's a lot of people, different types of people. I think I heard English more than I ever expected to hear it, whether that was in the U-Bahn, whether that was at a restaurant or at a park, and even other languages for that matter. It's very eccentric and stylish and artistic. There's constantly something happening, and if you make the effort, you will also find all kinds of activities for your kids. So if you're a parent and you're thinking perhaps the city's a little bit too vibrant for me. I would actually beg to differ and say it's probably the perfect type of city to move with the family if you're looking for a space that's a little bit more international in Germany, that feels a little bit more familiar. Then Berlin is definitely worth the hype. So in that sense, I would say yes, Berlin is worth the hype. Something else to consider, all things is Berlin worth the hype, is that Berlin is incredibly big. I was always surprised at how long it took us to get from one place to another. We moved in Berlin 3 times, so I believe we became more and more familiar with the city. And that was a beautiful experience. In hindsight, it didn't feel so great in the moment, but in hindsight, it really allowed us to be able to really get woven into the city that is Berlin, and different parts of the city as well. We lived in Neukölln, we lived in Mitte in the city center, and then eventually we moved closer to Schöneberg. And I feel all 3 of those places have a very different feeling and a vibe and a different kind of community, and we were very much embedded every single time we lived in those different places. So it's incredibly big. Took us over an hour at some point to get from where we lived to my daughter's school and to my job. That was incredibly strenuous while I was pregnant, and even more so when my son was born. So it wasn't so fun, to be very honest. We had very long days, constantly up and down. You always had to really factor in, if you wanted to do an activity with the kids, how long it would take you. So Berlin is incredibly big, and this is something that constantly surprised me. It still surprises me now that I'm back in South Africa, specifically in Cape Town now. The size of Cape Town in comparison to the size of Berlin is small. You know, it's much easier to get around here, and it definitely surprised me about Berlin. Another thing that surprised me about Berlin is the weather. I'm pretty sure there's some reason why the weather is so terrible in the northern parts of Germany, or maybe it's just climate change, but that is something that surprised me and something that stayed with me. For the year and a bit that we were in Germany, or in Berlin specifically, it was cold for 6 of those months. It just felt like we experienced a big, long, cold, miserable winter. It's extremely rainy, very windy. The weather is so up and down. One day it's super hot, the next day it's cold. That was not pleasant, and that was something that completely surprised me. But as you'd have it when you're in a different country, there's so many things that do feel uncomfortable, and there are so many things that do surprise you. I think you have a much higher tolerance for discomfort, perhaps, when you're in a different place. But like I've said in other videos, you know, when you're living abroad, certain things are highlighted. And one of those things that were highlighted for me was weather affects me. I didn't think so before. I used to think I was completely adaptable and very flexible and could live everywhere. But to be honest, this is something that I didn't particularly enjoy about the place. And now I'm living in an equally up and down climate area. Cape Town is no different, so it is what it is. But that was something that really surprised me. Another thing that really surprised me is just the housing market, hey? Let me rather put it this way. I think it's one of those things that you can really grasp when you're there. It's one thing to read about the fact that the place is overpopulated and there's hardly any apartments that are affordable, but it's another to truly experience it and to see the city and to really get a sense of what that really means. It was definitely the bane of my existence while I was there. It made my experience, or rather our experience in Germany, very difficult, especially as a family. And so I would caution any family, in fact I'd caution anyone, but more specifically, you know, my fellow Rents who are considering to move to Berlin, that you start looking maybe even half a year or a year in advance. The housing market is so bad. We experience all kinds of things in search of, you know, a place to stay, and you know, whether it was discrimination or exuberant you know, rental prices that didn't make sense, or whether it was having to move 3 times within a span of like 6 months, or whether being scammed. I was scammed twice. So those were all very, unfortunately, common experiences that I just never could have anticipated that I would have experienced in Berlin. And yes, I was cautioned the same way that I'm doing now in a video. And like I said, it's one of those things that you really get a sense of when you're there. It's very difficult to really understand how difficult that is, or that aspect of living in a capital city in Europe, in a country that's already very dense and overpopulated. you really only get a sense of it when you're there. There's so many people who live in house shares. Even in their adulthood, there's so many people who live with their kids and share with other people. I mean, there's all kinds of housing arrangements that are so popular in that part of the world that are not so popular, in my country where I come from. And so, to be honest, what has been incredibly refreshing to experience again is to be back in my country and not have to struggle with finding an apartment and having a spacious place for me and my kids, and not having to be anxious about the fact that we might have to move in the next couple of weeks and possibly getting scammed. Sure, those things can happen in South Africa as well, but the likelihood is just so much less because there's different factors in the apartment search, and our country's not as dense. If anything, you don't struggle to find an apartment if you can afford one. So it always boils down to affordability. And in some areas, there's also race. Obviously, some people get profiled. But to be honest, that's one thing I did not really know and understand fully, and could not understand fully until I was in the country. And that was, a terrible experience. So the apartment search, the housing market in Berlin is terrible, and that is something that definitely surprised me. Another thing that really surprised me was how dirty Berlin is. I have to say it. There's litter everywhere. Kumdaka. There's no sugarcoating it. The place is, it's quite messy. It's quite messy. There's a lot of graffiti everywhere, and there's people who appreciate it. I definitely appreciated the arty aspect of that city and its vibrance, and the fact that not everything was so neatly put. However, the litter, the dirt really did surprise me. So that's something that really surprised me about Berlin. And this is something that I'm saying not because I'm a particularly neat person myself, or a person who expects every city to look a certain way. Even in South Africa, I don't always have that expectation. However, there is definitely a very big difference between when you are in Berlin and another German city. You can immediately see it in the architecture firstly, but also just in the cleanliness of Berlin. This is definitely not coming from a place of judgment. It's just coming from purely my experience. The place is not clean. That's something that definitely surprised me. Another thing that really surprised me, which I found extremely cool and in a way was sad that I couldn't really experience in its fullness, is the art and film scene. The fact that that city is so eccentric and vibrant and cool. There's a very distinct Berlin style. If you are in an U-Bahn or walking on the street, if it wasn't invasive, you could easily take pictures of people and what they're wearing constantly. People are so free. At least that's the impression that you get when you're walking on the streets of Berlin. Very expressive, it seems like the place where people are free to do that. And I never really got to experience the clubbing scene or really go out and really explore and go to concerts as much as I would have wanted, or go to, and explore the art scene and the film scene because just of the circumstances during my time in Berlin. But that is something that I wish I could have experienced more, and even just my, the pockets or the moments that I was able to, I was always very, very pleasantly surprised by that and found it so incredibly refreshing. I think it's a city that is needed, perhaps in the German context, and I think sort of that the fact that you have this vibrance, this arty element of the capital city, and then you have the strong historical ties. I would be so interested to know how those sort of come together and coexist. And having, the Bundestag, the parliament there, and having so many other structures which are so deeply important in the German history in Berlin, and then having that coexist with the international centric elements of that city. It's just so fascinating, but it's also not unfamiliar. We have something very similar also in Johannesburg here in South Africa. It's just the vastness of it. There's constantly something happening, whether there's a concert or a poetry slam or an Afrobeats concert or, food festival, there is constantly something happening in Berlin. So if you're a person who likes to have a good time and you have an appreciation for the arts, or you have an appreciation for just doing pretty much anything, I think you can't go wrong in that city. And what I really appreciated is also how much you can experience the outdoors in a capital city like that. You know, there are pockets even within the city, parks, even just on the outskirts of Berlin, not far away, you can go for a nice hike. So you really have a nice balanced experience if you're a person who likes to explore. So Berlin is definitely, from my perception from the time I was there, the city to really go to if you have the energy and the time and the interest to explore, because there's just so much to explore and so much to do. Another thing that surprised me about Berlin, and this may not really resonate for people who live in other parts of Germany or perhaps who had a different experience, but I found the cost of living quite expensive. And I think that might have a lot to do with just the housing market and how you pay so much of, a huge chunk of your salary already goes to your apartment, so you don't have much else, left over, especially if you're there for a fellowship and you're doing research and you're there with kids. But I found it expensive. I found the cost of living quite expensive. I know that in comparison to perhaps Munich or, Bayern, Bavaria, it's obviously less expensive and a little bit more affordable, but I wouldn't let the masses lie to you, because I watch so many YouTube channels of people saying, it's so affordable to live in Berlin. You can get an apartment for 800 euros. Where? So I found that particularly untrue. It just did not reflect my experience, and I'm pretty sure my fellow friends, researchers, the people that I met, the people that I had conversations with can definitely share this experience as well. However, I could be wrong. It could just be my circumstances as a parent who had a little bit more to factor in and obviously more dependence, so my finances couldn't stretch as much as I would have wanted, but I did not expect the cost of living to be so hard on the pocket. I had all these plans to save money, to do X, to do Y. I couldn't do it. It was expensive. It was a very expensive experience, and I have enjoyed being able to exhale now that I'm back in my country. Not to say that Cape Town isn't expensive, but I definitely am not experiencing the month-to-month situation that I had when I was in Berlin. The last thing that really surprised me about Berlin is how child-friendly it is, how family-friendly it is. There are parks everywhere, there are activities for kids everywhere. Just a quick Google search. There's a family Facebook group that I found very quickly. In fact, there are many. There's also a bunch of other Facebook groups that are specifically targeted at families looking for activities for their kids, or families looking for au pairs or nannies. There's such a big online community to help parents navigate that space. But I think even without that, you ask somebody at a school or a colleague, there are always people who are willing to recommend activities and things to do, and that was something that I found extremely refreshing. And to be honest, I didn't have any expectation. I thought, okay, it's a new experience for all of us. Who knows what it is, what it feels like? Who knows what we'll struggle with? And sort of, but Berlin is definitely very family friendly, and I think if you are a family who wants your children to be open and free and expressive and explore their interests, particularly the arts, that's the right city to raise them. Definitely. Of course, it's a big city, it's a capital city. You're most likely to live in an apartment, even if you earn a little bit better than most people. So if it always boils down to the type of lifestyle that people wish for their kids. And I know some people want their kids to grow up, closer to farms or smaller cities, to be able to experience outdoors a little bit more, or less of the hustle and bustle of a big city. So of course this boils down to preference, but I can say that if you are a family that has no choice but to move to Berlin, I would say you should not be worried. I think it's a city that's really great, a great city to raise your kids. And definitely my daughter has benefited a lot from being in Germany just for the year and a bit that we were there. So I'll leave it there. That's today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what else you'd like me to talk about. I have a backlog of topics, all things my experience in Berlin. I must admit, it's so strange to be back in my country and reflecting on my experience, but you know, when they say hindsight is 2020, there's a lot of things that are just far more clearer to me now that I'm back. So I'm happy to still cover topics that have to do with relocation and reintegration. Happy to do that. Always love talking on this platform, and catch you next time.